people who disembarked in Virginia in 1619 were probably born in modern-day Angola, which is on the west coast of Africa, south of the Congo. These people had been purchased in Africa by a Portuguese trader who sold them to Spanish slave traders. The Spanish slave traders had them on their way to the Americas when they were stopped and captured by a Dutch vessel, which seized the Spanish cargo, including the enslaved people, and then sold them to English traders. So the English traders on the White Lion and the Treasurer were basically just looking for a good deal. We're looking for cargo that we can sell in Virginia. This Dutch ship is offering these enslaved people, and they said, sure, we'll take them. As coming from Angola, these Africans were something that was actually highly prized in Virginia, which was farmers. Remember, so many of the Virginians, the white Virginians, were people off the city streets. They were sailors, they were craftspeople, they were children. They were not farmers. And the thing that Virginia needed most at that moment was people who knew how to work a crop. So having people show up, these captured, sold Africans that actually are able to farm and give people some advice on what to do, they were very welcome. And I think that's the point when the Virginians said, this is a really good idea. We need more farmers. We can't really, it's too difficult to go kidnap a lot of English farmers, but we've got this supply of African farmers that's already being brought over by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch. Very quickly, it was British slave traders as well that were bringing over people who knew how to farm. And that's the first impetus in Virginia was not because these guys are African and we can exploit them. They had plenty of Englishmen that they could exploit, but they were farmers, and that's what was key. So from the first 20 or so that were brought in 1619, soon there were many, many, many more Africans being brought to America. By 1700, there were African servants in every colony, about 21,000 by 1700, which if you look at the overall population of the colonies was not a huge proportion of the population. After 1700, their presence in the colonies grew much, much more, and they came to be a much larger proportion of the population. Slavery was introduced to New York by the Dutch. By 1700, Africans were about 10% of the population in Massachusetts. They were about 30% of the population in Rhode Island, which had a very strong slave trading connection. So those of us who live in the North can't sit on our high horses and say, oh, it was the Southerners who did all the slavery. Early on, there were significant numbers of Africans being brought to all of the American colonies, not just into Virginia. And the people who were brought by the slave trade into America represented every segment of African communities. As Africans became more and more rapacious and eager to enslave their neighbors, they were not very choosy about saying who they were going to enslave. They were opportunistic. They grabbed people whenever they could. They invaded neighboring villages, captured the children, captured the adults, the men, the women. That meant that every element of a community could be enslaved. And you hear these stories of people who were chiefs, people who were already enslaved in Africa, everything in between, people that were brought into the American slave trade. That meant that they brought with them knowledge about every element of African society, of whatever community they had come from. Yes, they brought knowledge about agriculture and how to farm. They brought ideas about food, and so much of American food culture comes from African traditions. They brought African crafts, knowledge of how to make things that became guitars and banjos. ideas about rhythm and what music is, ideas about religion. All of this was captured in Africa, put into a giant shaker, and then planted in the Americas, where they then tried to build a new community that couldn't help but include a lot of these aspects of African society. And that giant shaker that I just mentioned was the Middle Passage. We have to talk about the experience of the Middle Passage as almost a character in its own right, as something that touches every person involved with slavery and the slave trade. It existed over an immensely long period of time. We begin in the 1500s with the Portuguese slave traders. The last shipment of Africans into the United States came in 1860 when it was illegal. It was something that was done on a dare. A guy basically said, yeah, I think I can still bring in Africans, and then he went and did it. The name of the Middle Passage, you'll hear different reasons about why it is called the Middle Passage. Sometimes they say, oh, it was this 3-stage journey and the voyage across the sea was the middle stage. Others talk about it kind of more in terms of identity. It was the transition between being an individual self-deciding human and being an enslaved person. Wherever it got the name, it was a traumatic voyage into American slavery. It was this change from being a free person in Africa to being an enslaved person in America. It was traumatic in physical, emotional, psychological, every way you can imagine. It was physically traumatic, being packed as tightly as possible into a vessel that was far too small. They overpacked the vessels at the beginning, knowing that there would be a high mortality rate and there would be room for the surviving enslaved people at the end of the voyage. Locked below decks in far too little space with so many other humans living, breathing, shitting, crying, all around you. It was physically simply horrific. Emotionally, most of the people in these vessels have been separated from their families, have been separated from their communities, everyone they know. They are surrounded by people who are speaking unfamiliar languages, people that worship gods they don't recognize. So that emotional disconnect is immensely traumatic. And simply psychologically, they're cut away from their sense of themselves as a person, the ability to decide what are they going to have for breakfast, what tasks are they going to do today. All of that individual agency is taken away from them, and they are told you're going to lie in this berth in chains until you're forced to get up and dance, jump around on a vessel on the deck, and then you're going to be given a few handfuls of food, and then you're going to be chained back into this spot. And that's all of that your existence is now for months. That psychological trauma is devastating to the people who experienced it. Once they had survived the Middle Passage, for those that survived the passage, they went through a process of sale. So they may have been sold before they got on the slave ship. They're sold again when they get off the slave ship. They go through a process of what was called seasoning, which was working people into the ability to work at crazy long hours, at crazy hard tasks in horrible environmental conditions. A lot of the Africans who ended up in Virginia and other parts of America began their experience of slavery in the West Indies, where they would be put in the sugar plantations or in other agricultural labor under really horrific conditions. If they survived that transition, they would be shifted up to be sold in North America, where they would have kind of a seal of approval of saying, this person survived the horrible conditions of the West Indies, so they'll probably survive in your tobacco field. And of course, they went through this transition into forced labor, again, from being able to determine their own tasks, their own choices about what labor they were going to do, to being forced into doing a particular kind of labor, whether they were trained in that or not. They're simply told, now you're going to grow tobacco, now you're going to grow sugar, now you're going to herd these sheep. Whatever the task was, they're forced into that labor. These experiences taken together for the African and African American community formed a community of trauma. And what I mean by that is, in a given community of enslaved people, whether it was a plantation of 100 people or a couple, 2 people that are held by some small farmers, their community was always people who had experienced this trauma. And we know today that that kind of trauma is not limited to the individual who experienced it. It's carried out in their relationships. It's carried out in the way they think about the world around them, about their expectations for the world around them, and then particularly in their relationships to their family and to their children. And so the Middle Passage caused this initial trauma for the enslaved population in the United States. The trauma of that is passed on to the children of the enslaved people. And the children of the enslaved people themselves, of course, are traumatized by the experience of slavery. And it creates something very unique in the African American community of being people who have been through this trauma and descended through this trauma and passed it on to the people today.